In 1864, America was a nation divided by a civil war in which the Union States of the North fought the rebellious Southern Confederacy. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of slavery. On the 14th of May, 1864, in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, George Richardson hosted a $200 reward in the Daily Dispatch for the return of his runaway slave, Henry. Richardson believed the fugitive was making his way to the enemy, to General Grant's forces, encamped just 60 miles away. For enslaved blacks like Henry, the Union Army represented freedom. But human bondage wasn't unique to the Confederate States in the South. On the same day that Richardson published his offer in Richmond, Pascal Favela posted a reward in the New York Herald for the return of Antonio Piccolo, an 11-year-old Italian harpist who had strayed from the subscriber's Manhattan dwelling. But the boy wasn't lost. He and 6 other Italian children had escaped from Favela, who was a brutal taskmaster. Remarkably, Antonio managed to evade his captor for more than a year. Determined to find the boy, Favela published additional rewards for his capture, raising the bounty each time. Whether he remained free or was eventually recaptured, Antonio's fate is unknown. However, his story is not unique. Thousands of young musicians were brought from Italy and forced to perform on American streets. When the Civil War ended, black slaves in the South achieved the freedom guaranteed by President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But in the northern states of the Union, the exploitation of Italian child musicians endured for decades.
The enslavement of children was already a common institution by the time of the Roman Empire. The practice gradually spread across Europe. In the 16th century, the governments of Spain and England passed laws against comprachicos, the buyers of children, who are better known as padrons. In 1861, the foreign minister of the newly formed Kingdom of Italy alerted his agents to the tragic exportation of the little Italians, the piccoli Italiani. Paris became the center of the activity in the 1860s. By 1868, the trade had become so pervasive that French authorities took measures to stop it. In April, Paris's Italian Society of Charity published the names and addresses of 59 padrons operating in the city. One of them, Raffaello de Grazia, was known on both sides of the Atlantic as the king of the padrons. He and other outlaws left France, moving their operations to the United States. Young Italian street performers began populating large urban centers on the eastern seaboard during the 1860s. Most of these children came to New York City, descending on Lower Manhattan, just north of the Five Points neighborhood. They were brought by padrons, who compelled the youngsters to entertain passers-by in exchange for donations. Some youths were forced to beg or steal. The master confiscated the day's earnings and punished those whose pickings were deemed inadequate.
Only an Italian boy's fiddle. That's all. Who cares? Though it is broken. He cries as though his heart would break, and carefully gathers up the broken fragments, every piece of the resonant wood, strings and all, and clasps them tightly to his bosom. Each piece, thus collected, was echoed by an additional throb of his little heart. "Move away. What's the matter with you?" inquired a big policeman. "The night bridgeman," answered a newsboy. "That big man, with blue clothes and side whiskers, he broke his fiddle. He kicked him, his fiddle fell, and he kicked that too, and broke it." "Poor boy," said a kind-looking lady. "What are you crying for?" The story was repeated to her, and another boy added, "He's afraid he'll get licked if he goes home with his broken fiddle." "Yes, he'll get licked sure," said another little newsboy. Too bad, I suppose he will."
One night in March 1873, Felice Padula and several companions were playing cards in a dingy Manhattan apartment when 10-year-old Niccolo Pizzo entered the room, crying. The child was holding a broken violin. Padula was a padrone, and Pizzo was one of his slaves. At the sight of the splintered instrument, Padula flew into a rage. Jumping from his chair, he knocked the boy to the ground and savagely kicked him in the back. The youngster emitted a piercing scream, after which he lay motionless. Cold with fear, Padula carried the limp child into another room and sent his guests away. He fled to Italy, and Niccolo Pizzo was never seen again. In August 1873, a cruel padrone was charged with coercing a young Italian boy to beg on the streets of New York. The case attracted national attention as the accused man, Vincenzo Motto, was charged with violating the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. The high-profile indictment promptly spawned a Broadway show titled "The Slave of the Harp." The performance featured playwright Edward Harrigan as a padrone, and Jenny Yeomans, who played the part of his Italian slave. The production was an instant success and eventually reached audiences across the country. Americans were fascinated by the foreign entertainers in their midst. Yet, the idealized depictions of the little musicians contrasted sharply with the grim realities of poverty and abuse. In 1873, the Italian government outlawed the trafficking of child musicians. The practice became illegal in the United States the following year. Yet, the first padrone was not convicted until 1880. Small wonder that many oppressed youngsters chose to run away from their captors. At the height of the phenomenon in 1872, Horatio Alger wrote Phil the Fiddler, the tale of a 12-year-old Italian violinist who escaped from a New York padrone. Although the narrative was fictional, Alger based it on contemporary events. He explained his reason for writing the book.
If the story of Phil the Fiddler, in revealing for the first time to the American public the hardships and ill treatment of these wandering musicians, shall excite an active sympathy in their behalf, the author will feel abundantly repaid for his labors.
Although Phil was fictitious, dozens of real-life Italian children made daring escapes and gained a precarious freedom in America. This is their story.